everyone for tuning in. So just bear with me while I share my screen for my presentation. Hang on a sec. Archil, is the correct screen sharing?
So good, Zdenka.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so so I'm an academic staff member here in the School of Physics at the University of Sydney, and my research is very interdisciplinary. So I guess broadly you'd describe it as biomedical physics or physics in medicine and biology. I'm very much a physicist, and I collaborate a lot with other people from other disciplines, so engineering, medicine, and I guess what I'll be talking about today is one of my pet projects. It's kind of like my blue sky project, and it's a really good example of how physics can contribute to really highly interdisciplinary research. So in this case, this particular research topic certainly involves physics, so that's where I'm contributing to it, but it also involves AI, so that's mostly in the computer science realm. Now, what's also really interesting, most people might not realize this, but AI also now has merged into AI hardware. So a lot of this research topic also involves electrical engineers. And I'll also be talking about some of the nanotechnology that's used to build novel hardware of this type. And so that now involves materials scientists and other people working in sort of nanofabrication and that sort of thing. But it also involves chemists as well. And if I didn't mention it already, it definitely involves neuroscience as well. So a really good example of interdisciplinary research, and that's what kind of interests me the most. So I'll be talking a little bit about what physics can bring to gaining new insights into some of these really hot topics like AI research and also AI in hardware. And I guess I'm going to try and convince you that physics can really put a different spin on some of these cutting-edge research topics that are being looked at today, particularly involving AI. So you can see from the title of what I'm going to talk about today, it's looking at this idea of intelligence more broadly and how you can understand where intelligence comes from a physics perspective. I'll be sort of talking about this idea of emergence, and emergence is a property that emerges from a many-body system. So you have many elements interacting together. And I'll be talking about neuromorphic systems. So the word neuromorphic just means brain-like. So you can already get a sense that we're going to be touching on a whole bunch of these different discipline areas. Okay. So before I start talking about the specific details, I just want to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who have contributed to this. And as I mentioned, it's very interdisciplinary, but I guess my two key international collaborators are Tomonobu Nakayama from Japan and Jim Ginjuski from UCLA, and then of course a whole bunch of students and postdocs, and the postgrad research students that you see up here on the top left-hand side are current students who are currently working on this project. So some of the slides that I'll be presenting include some of the results from their work. Right, so I just want to firstly introduce this research topic with a historical context. Now, hopefully all of you would have heard of Alan Turing. He's probably most famous for the what's now called the Turing test, the idea about whether you can actually devise a test that will be able to tell whether a machine has human intelligence. But I think it's fair to say that fewer people are actually familiar with some of his really early work in the 1940s. So in the early 1940s was when Alan Turing was first looking at this idea of brain-inspired machine intelligence. So he was really thinking about how the human brain works, you know, what's really going on in the neural network inside the cortex, and thinking about whether there were processes going on in there that could be emulated in a machine to then produce similar or, you know, perhaps even slightly different type of intelligence. Now, his very early work came up with what has subsequently been known as the non-deterministic Turing machine. Now, non-deterministic is really important because it actually is quite different from what eventually became known as the universal Turing machine, which is what all, you know, modern digital computation is based on. You know, if A, do B, then do C. So you have this set of logical instructions that a computer will follow. But in a non-deterministic Turing machine, the idea is that you don't just have, you know, very sequential instructions, but you can have a whole, instead have different possibilities. So if A, do B, or do C, or do D, and each one of those would then branch out even further. So hence kind of emulating this non-determinism method, if you like, of how to process information. That idea, which we now refer to as a non-deterministic Turing machine, kind of fizzled away because what happened in the late 1940s and the early 1950s was that the transistor was invented. And the transistor naturally lent itself to the era of modern computation. So that's when, you know, computers started to be developed. They suddenly started to become these efficient machines. And of course, Turing's ideas that developed out of his very early ideas lent themselves quite naturally to these computing machines that are really based on the model of the universal Turing machine. Now, the other thing that happened in the 1950s and going into the 60s was when the first ideas started to emerge around what we currently refer to as artificial neural network models, which is what AI is based on today as we know it. And this can be attributed to people like Rosenblatt and from Cornell and Minsky from MIT, who came up with this idea of trying to simulate in an algorithm how neurons work and extending from that how a neural network might work. And so Minsky is really sort of now generalizing to this idea of a multi-layer network that we're today familiar with deep learning models. The 1970s is kind of recognised as what's known as AI winter because a lot of these original ideas just became too computationally prohibitive to implement. It would take ages to actually compute something that would be of interest. And of course, there wasn't all the data that we have around with us today. So research in this area really died off quite a lot throughout the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, there was a resurgence, and that was mainly due to the rapid increase in computing power, but also memory as well. There were new memory technologies. And of course, as we go into the 1990s, we started to see more data become available, which has really exponentially grown since then as well. But then there was sort of another development in the 1990s. Carver Mead at Caltech sort of started this idea that subsequently was labelled neuromorphic engineering. So he was an engineer and he was really tinkering with hardware. So up until that time, these ideas around neural network models were all in algorithm. And Carver Mead was the first one to say, well, you know, maybe we could build something in hardware. Maybe we could actually now, instead of just using the computers to compute the software algorithms, maybe we could just sidestep that and actually see what we can do directly in hardware. So this is a really important milestone because when you think about, you know, the human brain as a model, it is a piece of hardware. So people like to draw comparisons with algorithms and with code, you know, how do you decode, you know, the biological neural network. But at the end of the day, it's a piece of hardware, and all the neuroscientists in the world today still don't know completely how it works. So this analogy with a computer and computation can only go so far. So me really now created this whole new research area where he really brought in all the electrical engineers to try and develop new electronic hardware based on the real human brain. So this is really when there was now this split between the traditional, I guess, computer scientists that worked on the algorithms versus the hardware engineers, mostly the electrical engineers, because these are all electrical systems in hardware. And that split has kind of continued to diverge. And meanwhile, the neuroscientists are kind of nowhere really to be seen. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. So here comes 1997, and I guess probably the highlight of that year as far as AI is concerned is that IBM's Deep Blue actually beat the chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov. So this was really like when AI really came back into the fore, and of course by then we had all the computing power we need and also quite a lot of data that's needed for training these kinds of models for specific tasks. Now, of course, we're in the 21st century and AI is absolutely everywhere. We can't get away from it, and it's doing some really amazing things. And I would have to say that probably that's more to do with the amount of data that we have available rather than the increases in computing power, which have really stymied off because of Moore's law. So the thing with AI is that it does really, really well at very, very specific things, as long as you have lots and lots of data for that very specific thing. So as long as you tick all those boxes, you can do some interesting things. So you need big data, lots of computing, lots of memory as well, and you have to focus on a very specific task. So what's really interesting now is that people who are actually doing research on in AI are really going after what's known as the Holy Grail, which is this idea of artificial general intelligence. So I mentioned that AI is really good at doing really, really specific tasks, as long as there's a lot of pre-processed data available to train for that particular task. But as soon as you train an AI model for that task, if you try and get it to do something else, it completely forgets everything from that previous task and you have to start from scratch. So in other words, you can't train an AI model for one thing and then use it for something else. Now, this is in stark contrast to this notion of general intelligence that we get from the way in which human intelligence is defined. You know, we as humans, when we learn something, we're able to learn other things that are not necessarily, you know, connected with the first thing that we learned. So there's something else that's missing from these AI models that has got to do with, you know, how do you adapt to changing inputs of data? How can you be less reliant on data quantity as opposed to quality? So there's some key differences in the way in which artificial intelligence works compared to what I would describe as natural intelligence that humans possess, for example. So I've just jotted down a few things here in this table. So on the left-hand side, we've got a few characteristics of machine computation, and on the right-hand side, comparing that to, you know, the way in which humans process information. So machines are very deterministic. You know, you give them clear instructions and they follow those instructions to the T. Whereas humans are non-deterministic. You know, everybody who's sitting here listening to my talk is probably getting different things from it with every single slide. And so if I asked you to do something at the end, you'd probably do something different, each and every one of you. So we have this non-determinism built into the way in which our brains work, and indeed no two brains are alike either, so that contributes to that. So machine computation is also precise, and we want them to be precise because we use them to calculate useful things. But the way in which humans compute things is imprecise. It's more probabilistic. So again, we have this sort of range of variance, if you like, when we want to calculate something as individuals. Machine computation is really, really good at repetitive tasks, so doing something over and over and over again and repeating that and being very reliable with those answers. And again, we want them to be like that for the tasks that we give them. On the other hand, if you put a human to do a very repetitive task, they would get extremely bored. And conversely, what humans are good at doing, they're not good at doing repetitive tasks, but what they are good at doing is adapting to their changing surroundings. So in other words, humans will continuously pivot as circumstances change. And that's related to this last characteristics as well. Machine computation, and in particular all AI models today, only work on static data. So you think about all the fancy object and image recognition tasks that AI is famous for doing. That is all done on static data. You collect the data, you take it off into the cloud, you do your training, and then you get the result. And what we do, in contrast, is highly dynamic. As I'm talking to you, you're getting all this sensory input from my voice. You're also getting visual input from the slides. Perhaps other kinds of input that you're registering as noise that you want to suppress. And this is all being processed by your brain in real time. So you're not sending this off somewhere else to process it and come back again. This is all happening in a highly dynamic fashion. So the way in which AI models are constructed and the way in which they work today is great for the type of tasks that we set them to do, really high definition image recognition tasks, for example. But if we're really interested in trying to get machines to have a more brain-like information processing capabilities, then we need to look to some of these other characteristics. And in the end, we probably will have to deconstruct what current artificial neural network models are doing in order to be able to realize some of these other properties if we want to have machines that do some of these other tasks that AI models can't do. And some of these other tasks are starting to become very pertinent. So again, AI is great if you've got a lot of data, you can afford to do all the training in the cloud, that sort of thing. But one of the big growing areas that we have at the moment is streaming data. So you think about how much data is being streamed just in the last 5 years. Netflix has come online, everything's done, we're still using the cloud, but very soon, particularly with 5G networks coming online, everything's going to be connected and all that data is just going to be streaming. We are not going to have time to send things to the cloud, do some fancy processing and, get some kind of information out of it. So we are looking at having new capabilities where you don't need to pre-label data. The data itself might not be large, it might be small, it might be complex and unstructured, and we need to process information from it on the fly. So that is a completely different proposition from the one that AI solves. Okay, so now to the main part of what I wanted to talk about with this project, which is, so how can we sort of use physics in particular to look at what is really more brain-like when we think about intelligence. So as I mentioned, I'm working with people from different disciplines, and this project is really something that brings together physics with a bit of neuroscience and also nanotechnology. And the physics comes, I guess, in a couple of places. The first place that physics comes into it is in the broad area of complex physical systems. And in the case of the brain, you could argue that the brain is probably the most complex physical system in the whole universe. So it's a great place to bring some of the ideas and methodologies from complex physical systems to bear, not just on the brain, but onto neuromorphic systems more generally. Now, the really, I guess, important point about complex physical systems is because what we're looking at here is really a system that's composed of many elements, a many-body system, that all of those elements are interacting with each other. In many cases, in the real world, in real complex systems like the brain, those interactions are highly nonlinear, and the interactions lead to emergent phenomena. So in other words, 2 + 2 = 5. You get more than just the sum of its parts. So that's what's really interesting about complex physical systems. And the other aspect of this, where we're bringing in physics, is through the nanotechnology part. So what I'm going to show you is an actual physical system that we have made and are still making that uses nanotechnology from bottom-up self-assembly. Now, for those of you who don't know too much about nanotechnology, the thing to remember with nanotechnology is the following. There are 2 types of nanotechnology. One type is the type where you make nanoscale structures using a top-down approach, which is basically you need a clean room and you use sophisticated fabrication techniques like electron beam lithography, for example, to make very precise, very well designed structures. And this is pretty much how chips are made. So all the big computer chip companies in the world will have their own nanofab labs and so on. And incidentally, we have a very nice clean room fabrication facility here at Sydney Uni, right behind the School of Physics at the Sydney Nano Hub. Now, the second type of nanotechnology, and these are split pretty much 50-50, instead of doing top-down fabrication, you use bottom-up self-assembly. Now, what does that mean? That's very much a chemistry approach, where basically you bring a whole bunch of different elements together in a test tube or whatever, and you let the system devise its own nanoscale structures. So it's basically a minimum energy approach, and you can create novel nanoscale structures just by bringing things together and controlling the structure through things like temperature and pressure and so on. So chemists do this all the time. Now, regardless of which nanotechnology methodology you use, the really interesting thing in terms of the science is that whenever you shrink something down to nanoscales, you're basically geometrically confining that material onto a nanoscale, and you're changing the structure or if you like, the functionality of that material. So if you think about the electronic structure, as soon as you shrink something down to a nanoscale, even just in one dimension, you start to change its functionality because of that geometric confinement. And so that's why nano is so exciting, because you can pretty much shrink anything down. It starts to exhibit interesting physical properties that are quite different from its bulk properties. So anyway, in this case, we're working with particular types of nanomaterials and nanoscale structures that we create using bottom-up self-assembly. And in this case, the type of structures that we create are nanowires, and they self-assemble into a neural network-like topology. And because they're nanowires, they're also electrically responsive, so they create an electrical circuit. And this is what they look like. Well, this is one version of what they look like. So hopefully you can kind of see why they're so interesting as an example of a neuromorphic system, because the nanowires, which are these really long white things here, through this bottom-up self-assembly process, just naturally form a network that kind of looks like a neural network. So the nanowires themselves are quite long. They're probably, they can range anywhere from like 50 microns in length to a few hundred microns in length. So there's a huge variance in their length, but it's the width that's a nanoscale. So typically their widths are anywhere from a few nanometers, maybe up to 10 nanometers. And we coat them with a particular polymer to get some really interesting functionality out of them that I'll talk about in a minute. But just to press this point further about drawing this similarity between these nanowire networks and biological neural networks. So you can see here on the right-hand side, just by visually comparing the two types of structures, how similar they are. And in fact, we've done some really interesting topological analysis, just comparing these self-assembled nanowire networks with the topologies of neural networks that are studied in neuroscience, and found them to be incredibly similar. And, you know, in retrospect, that's not too surprising, because bottom-up self-assembly is the way in which all biology works. So biology is, whenever it makes structures of increasing complexity, it does that through bottom-up self-assembly. So this approach in nanotechnology is you know, ideally suited to creating nanostructures that are bio-inspired. Now, the other bit of interesting physics that comes in here, apart from the complexity and the complex physical systems aspect of it, is the fact that you can see in the figure up here that the nanowires are kind of all over the place. And when they form through this bottom-up self-assembly process, they form a lot of junctions. The junctions are where the nanowires overlap with each other. Now, I mentioned earlier that we actually work with nanowires that are coated with a polymer. The nanowires we use are metallic, they're silver. We've explored some other metals as well. And when they're coated with a polymer is of course insulating, silver is reasonably conducting. So when they form a junction where nanowires overlap, you form a metal insulator metal junction. And that's really interesting, because when that junction is biased, so there's a voltage bias across it, something interesting happens. So if you look at the diagram on the bottom right, this is sort of a schematic representation of what's going on at these nanowire junctions. So the nanowire junctions, so we have silver nanowire, and then there's PVP is the particular polymer that we use, is now the insulator in between two silver nanowires that are overlapping with each other. So initially, because of this insulating polymer layer, this is a non-conducting state, these junctions. But as soon as there's a bias across it, what happens is that individual silver cations start to migrate across this insulator. So the insulator is electrically insulating, but actually it turns out to be ionically conducting, allowing these silver cations to migrate across. And so you can see what happens here is that the silver cations end up forming an atomic bridge, a kind of a filament across this nanometer scale layer. So that polymer is maybe about 2 nanometers in length. Now, interestingly, also, the width of that insulating layer, about 2 nanometers, is comparable to the Fermi length of silver. And that actually promotes electron tunneling. So that's a quantum effect. So just before that filament actually completes its bridge, as that gap gets smaller and smaller, you'll start to get electrons tunneling across. And that ends up kind of triggering some really interesting dynamics that actually, I guess, exacerbates the effect of this conductive bridge. Because what happens is that that junction ends up switching quite suddenly from a very low conducting state, which we call an off state, to a high conducting state, which we call on. and the difference in conductivity is about 3 orders of magnitude. So it's not superconducting, but it's a very significant switch in conductance state. Now, if we compare this schematic to schematically what's happening between neurons, where there's also a junctions, which is this schematic diagram on the left-hand side. So neurons work in a similar way. So whenever there's an action, what's known as an action potential, so again, there's a stimulus, an electrical stimulus of some kind, and that actually triggers neurotransmitter molecules from one neuron to another neuron on the other side. And that process is known as a synaptic connection. And you can actually measure then the voltage response of that synaptic connection as a result of that response. So these nanowire junctions in our complex network act like synthetic synapses. And incidentally, there's another interesting bit of physics here where the conductance that we observe experimentally is actually quantized as well. And that, again, is because of that geometrical confinement. So there's 2 of the physics aspects are the complexity and the topology of the network structure and the adaptive synthetic synapses. And so we have been and are still studying these 2 aspects to look at how we might be able to develop these systems into doing some interesting information processing that is quite different from AI models. And I guess the most popular type of AI models are the deep learning models, where you have columns or layers of individual neurons, as shown on the right-hand side here. And this is all in algorithm, in software, and they're all connected with each other. And then you have an input layer where you feed in some signal, and then an output layer where you get the output. And the training is basically trying to figure out the weight matrix that represents the weights of all the synaptic connections between those artificial neurons. Now, in our case, we don't do any of that. The synaptic connections, which are shown in this graphical representation here, self-adjust. So we feed the signal in and the network just self-adjusts and distributes voltage around the network itself. And then we can read out from a single node or multiple nodes or however. So it really is now starting to better represent the way in which a real brain works, in the sense that in order to calculate something in a real brain, you don't need to manually adjust the weightings of all the synaptic connections. The brain does it itself. So I mentioned we've been looking at the topology of these systems, which is quite interesting, and we've been looking at different types of methodologies that are used in neuroscience as well as in computer science, just purely from the complex systems type approaches. And I guess probably the most important aspect here is that random structures in a network are actually not that efficient for doing interesting information processing. You need to have some structure in the network. And one of the structures that's been shown to be quite favourable for efficient communication is the structure known as small world structure. And that doesn't just go for, you know, the biological neural networks, but it's for all sorts of networks, everything ranging from you know, the internet through to social network, other social networks, and so on. One of my PhD students, Alan Lofer, has been looking at that in particular, and found some really interesting results comparing our self-assembled nanowire networks with different types of network topologies, random network topologies, but also looking at artificial neural network topologies, which are based around bipartite graphs. And there are some really significant differences in the network structure. And we know from all the research that's been done in neuroscience that structure and function are inextricably linked. So that suggests that cognitive function is really influenced by the network structure. So going back to how we actually then model what's going on at the junction level, because that is actually then going to affect the system level behaviour as well. So in order to solve this, so we have a very complex network, it's an electrical system, because it's not in a nice electrical grid as they appear in textbooks, for example. We actually have developed a methodology to actually solve Kirchhoff's circuit laws, to actually then solve for the electrical response of the network itself. So taking into account, of course, all the physics that goes on at the junctions as well. So again, we can stimulate the network in different ways with different input signals, and study the different responses and get it to do some interesting things that I'll mention in a little bit. So this is now a simulation of the network, and it's just showing how the network self-adjusts. It has this adaptive dynamics as the network connectivity interacts with the synapse level nonlinear interactions between the nanowires itself. And the white lines you can see emerging here are current paths that naturally form in the optimal locations across the network. And as the network evolves, more and more of these junctions switch on. And once they switch on, they allow current to pass through. So again, it's a very adaptive network, and it self-regulates itself, so a completely different style of operation from the way in which artificial neural networks work. Another one of my PhD students, Joel Hochstetter, has also been looking at some of the emergent collective properties of these networks, focusing on features such as this very first transport path that forms, and other studies have shown that this type of pathway is really important for information processing. He's been looking at some of the dynamics, in particular critical dynamics, looking at concepts like the sort of avalanche statistics that occur in this network, and comparing it to similar types of analysis that's been done in neuroscience based on brain data from EEG data mostly. Looking also at this idea of criticality and phase transitions. So we know from other physics contexts that many macroscopic phenomena arise from collective dynamics, and superconductivity is a really good example of that. And there's been a lot of research done on nanomaterials that are showing really novel materials that are starting to show these kind of interesting dynamics on the nanoscale. And so the materials that we're using here with nanowires are starting to look like they fall into this class of nanomaterials that show really interesting physical properties like phase transitions that arise from their nanoscale geometric confinement. And again, we're also relating our findings to other studies that have been done by physicists actually in the context of brain physics. So there's other interesting features in our system like hysteresis loops, and hysteresis is a good indicator of memory properties. And in fact, memory is indeed absolutely critical for information processing. So here's an example from our simulations that shows in orange some voltage pulses that are fed into the network, and then in black the conductance response of the network. And you can see that when the voltage pulses stop, the network conductance persists for a period of time. And we can actually control the period of time that the network is able to retain that memory of previous states just by adjusting the type of pulses and how long they're applied for, even reaching these sorts of what's known as indefinite memory states. This is really important for demonstrating this for information processing capabilities. We've done a bunch of experiments as well with our colleagues in Japan and at UCLA as well, showing how the collective memory of these nanowire networks can actually is actually used by the network to remember previous pathways that have formed. So if you stimulate one pathway with an electrode put in one position, and then you put the electrode in another position, and you change the ordering around that, the network will actually remember previous pathways that were established with previous electrode positions. And again, that's really important for demonstrating learning capacity. And we've done a similar thing connecting a multi-electrode array to form some kind of pattern. So in this case, there's 9 electrodes formed in a 3x3 array, and you can send through different patterns. So you stimulate certain electrodes to create a pattern, and you train it just by doing that for a period of time. You only leave one electrode available as the drain electrode to turn the other ones off for the training period, and then after you open all the electrodes, and the network then demonstrates preferentially the transduction pathways that it established before. And this is just another simulation demonstrating the adaptive dynamics of capabilities of the network. So in this simulation, the network is being stimulated by multiple pulses. So you can kind of see the network light up. That's all the junctions lighting up with each pulse. And with each pulse, there's actually more and more junctions switching on, because not only does the network remember previous junctions that have been switched on, it opens up new ones as well. And when current pathways form like they are now, it remembers very quickly the previous current pathways that have formed, and also forms new pathways. So again, this idea that memory is very much goes hand in hand with the adaptive dynamics that is attributed to what's going on at the junctions, the nonlinear dynamics at the junctions, but also the network connectivity. And lastly, this is a really neat result that demonstrates a common benchmarking task. So people who are working on either AI or other types of intelligence models have a whole range of benchmarking tasks for demonstrating what their particular approach can do. And in this case, this benchmarking task is known as the Mackey-Glass forecasting task. So the Mackey-Glass is a famous signal that's based on a nonlinear dynamical equation that has a parameter in it which you can change to shift the system from a non-chaotic to a chaotic state. And you can actually adjust how chaotic that system becomes. So it's a really good task for testing whether a particular method can actually predict unpredictable signals, because that's what chaotic signals are. And so in this case, this shows one of our examples by one of my other PhD students, Rumen, of predicting this chaotic signal. So the signal is fed into the network. So this is as a voltage input. And the blue here represents the period of time over which the signal is fed into the network. And this also represents a training period. And then after that, we don't feed the signal anymore, we stop it, and we just let the network calculate the next step in the signal. So in other words, predicting the signal thereafter. And you can see there in red all the prediction steps. In blue, we've also had to adjust some of those steps because the prediction isn't perfect, because this is a chaotic signal. So as soon as you get small deviations, they amplify exponentially because it's chaotic, the dynamics. But since we published this particular result, Rumen has actually improved the methodology even more, and the results are even more impressive. So this is actually quite a significant milestone for us in demonstrating learning capacity for these particular systems. We're also doing things like pattern recognition and stuff like that. That's not really our objective. We're just doing that because, you know, they're kind of common benchmarking tasks. But what we're really interested in doing is working with data that's complex, that's unstructured, like these chaotic signals, unpredictable, that might be sporadic. So if you think about real data that's collected from sensors, that might be collected from a satellite, there's always huge gaps in that data, and the data is never complete, and indeed it's not structured. And those are precisely the types of data that you can't use AI for. It's, you know, AI really needs very clean, very well labeled data and in very large quantities. So again, we're looking at all this other type of data that is now being generated that, you know, is not being processed. So how can we get more information from that type of data? And so lastly, I just want to finish up with a summary. And I guess the take-home message really is intelligence is physical. And some of you may may view this as a sort of a deja vu thing, because there's a famous saying, information is physical, that was actually postulated by the physicist Landauer, but has actually since shown not to be true. It's a separate story altogether. But in this case, we're really looking at this idea that intelligence isn't a piece of algorithm, it's not a piece of code, it's something that stems from the physical nature of a highly complex system, many-body system, and physics has a really important role to play in understanding these types of systems. And the second point is emergence and emergent phenomena are really key to understanding natural intelligence. And the third point is really sort of more about the outlook. So I've shown you some snippets of some of the nanotechnology and the hardware that's being developed. And our idea is really to look at developing a synthetic neural network on chip. So this is, again, completely different from standard electronics. But the idea would be that to interface this with a multi-electrode array to then be able to interface with the real world and process natural data. So that's it for my overview of this particular research topic that I'm working on. So I look forward to finding out what all of you have asked in terms of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zdenka, very much for this wonderful talk. And I think we can take now questions. Don't hesitate to unmute the mic and speak out. Oh, I think we have a question in the chat from Curious Soul.
Curious Soul, yeah. So is this just incidental, or the nanoWires delivery made to be made? It's completely incidental. So this bottom-up self-assembly technique, every time you form one of these systems, and incidentally, you can make these systems really quickly in an afternoon in the lab. Every time you form this system, you get a different statistical realization. But nevertheless, every realization forms this very complex network. So it's as if you can, you know, when we're talking about people's brains, every single person on this screen has a different brain, has a different statistical realization of a brain. So it's quite similar to the variance in real biological neural networks. So the key really is using this bottom-up self-assembly approach, which is very different from the top-down fabrication approach that's commonly used in nanotechnology in clean rooms, where everything has to be very well designed beforehand, and then you go into the clean room and you follow that design very carefully to fabricate a very precise structure. Any other questions?
Oh, we have another question. Maybe you can repeat the question, Zdenka. So
yeah. So would the new type of chip require both bottom-up and top-down fabrication? That's a great question. The short answer is yes, because to make these multi-electrode arrays, that is made with top-down fabrication. And we have two options there. So these, they're called MEAs. So there are commercial off-the-shelf ones that are made, and we're using that for our research. But eventually, if we want to commercialize this, we probably would want to integrate our own design